So everybody got the invitation and basically knows what we are going to talk today. But ladies and gentlemen, excellencies, welcome to our meeting today. 8 years ago, 1 year after the referendum on leaving EU, I last spoke about Britain in our room and analyzed reasons why Britain does not fit into European Union. After lengthy negotiations, the factual exit happened in 2020. Is that better? Our today's guest, Mr. Richard MOIR, London-based strategic thinker and advisor to governments and corporates, and a subtle observer of international situation in relation to the key question: where is Britain 5 years after Brexit, and how it positions itself within the rapidly changing international setup. Mr. MOIR was born in Bermuda. His Scottish-Irish family later moved to the Bahamas, where they still reside. He was educated in Edinburgh at Merchiston's, one of the, as you probably know, one of the 3 top public schools in Scotland, alongside with Fettes and Gordonstown. Then he studied at the University in Toronto, the London School of Economics, and the Institute of Political Studies in Paris. As agreed, Mr. MOIR will bring his view of the current state of the post-Brexit UK, plus its implications for relations, let's say, with Slovenia, the region, the Balkans, and the wider EU. It's a very large topic. The talk will be moderated by me, Marjan Šetinc, President of the Slovenian Association for International Relations. But before passing the mic to our guest, I'll take a few minutes to introduce today's main topic. Britain was once an empire where the sun never sets. But despite losing its colonies, it still retains some imperial, not only through the Commonwealth of Nations, organization of 56 independent countries, but also through royal sovereignty. In 15 states, Canada and Australia, the largest constitutional monarchies among them, covering 18 million square kilometers of land mass and over 80 million people. Regardless of these lingering imperial traces, Britain is one of the world's leading economies, 6th by nominal GDP, and 10th by purchasing power GDP. After 2 failed attempts due to opposition from Charles de Gaulle, Britain was admitted to the EEC in 1973. For that, among some other conditions, it had to switch to the metric system, which, however, has still not been fully adopted to this day. In the first referendum, just 2 years after entering the EEC in 1975, voters confirmed membership in the EEC. During 40 years of EU membership, Britain secured exemptions from Schengen, justice and home affairs, and the Charter of Fundamental Rights. These opt-outs allowed the UK to avoid adopting the common currency, participating in the borderless Schengen, accepting automatic application of some justice and home affairs laws, and not being bound by the Charter. Moreover, 3 months before the Brexit, the day of referendum, the European Council on the 18th and 19th February 2016 generously, in inverted commas, accepted additional conditions for Britain to remain in the EU. Prime Minister David Cameron summarized these conditions as follows, and were accepted by the European Council. I was very critical at that time, but maybe we will have a chance to talk about this later on. Let me tell what David Cameron said in the Parliament. Britain will be permanently out of ever closer union, never part of a European superstate. There will be tough new restrictions on access to our welfare system for EU migrants, and no more something for nothing. Then Britain will never join the euro. The next, Cameron said, I believe it is enough for me to recommend that the United Kingdom remain in the European Union, having the best of both worlds. And continued, we will be in the parts of Europe that work for us. And we will be out of the parts of Europe that don't work for us. Out of the open borders, out of the bailouts, out of the euro, and out of all those schemes in which Britain wants no part. Of course, all these opt-outs lost their relevance after UK left the EU. The Brexit referendum was held on the 23rd June 2016. At that time, just 3 weeks before 23rd June, I spoke here about what we could expect. I believed at that time that the British would not vote to leave. I was convinced that they would not give up their privileged position in the EU and, of course, generous opt-outs. But it happened. Fake data and lies such as Brussels is stealing our money, supported by slogans, take back control, or let's take back control, coined by, probably you remember, Dominic Cummings, the director of the Vote Leave campaign, spread widely and ultimately prevailed, claiming we will be better off outside the EU, and some even spoke, we were empire, why shouldn't we be again an empire? So, where is Britain 5 years after Brexit? What has happened in these 5 years? Has Britain done better than formerly within the EU? Are there sentiments for the EU among the British? Have people really believed nothing will change, that exiting the EU will not change the position of the EU in Europe and wider? Of course, there are many other questions which I'm sure will come from you as well. So, where is UK 5 years on in the world, which is quite different from the world in 2016, when the referendum took place? Mr. MOIR, the word and the microphone is yours.
Well, thank you, Marjan. Good afternoon, distinguished guests and ladies and gentlemen. Now, I don't have all the answers. I wouldn't pretend to. But I need to say this first of all. I'm here in a private capacity. I'm not speaking for any one organization in particular. That's the first point. Secondly, I have to declare an interest because I voted to remain. So that's the first point. But I will try in this presentation to be objective because it's not all bad and it could be better. But in order for you to understand where I'm coming from, I think we should adopt, let's say, the LSE approach. And if you remember, well, you'll know now because I'm going to tell you the motto of the LSE, Marjan, is what? As we both went there. No, it's being bound to know the causes of things. Well, let's go and look at the causes of this Brexit. How did we get there? But I want to tell you my conclusion, which is where I ultimately plan to lead you. I'm trying to take a lawyer's approach, so I'll give you the case for the defense and the case for the prosecution, and then hopefully you'll make up your own mind, but you need to know that I'm a Remainer, and I think it's sad that we've inflicted these wounds on ourselves, but leave it at that. So the first point I want to make is this, and this was what the minister responsible for Europe and European negotiations said just the other day. Nick Thomas Simmons is his name. And he said he could not see the country re-entering the EU in his lifetime, despite the thaw in continental relations and the reset, which has been ongoing over the last few months. So the first point I would like to make is this: it's not likely to happen anytime soon. But what will happen, I would forecast, and it's a relatively easy forecast to make, is that relations will start and indeed have started to improve, as indeed Slovenia can vouch, and I'll come on to that later on in my presentation about UK-Slovene relations, which are actually fundamentally very good, and it's great to see you here this evening to back up what I'm going to say, and I'm telling you that, because you will, of course. Thank you. So, not likely to join anytime soon. So please don't expect that. However, what we need to understand is how we got into this situation in the first place. And this is why I would commend this book to you, because what Britain has gone through, I would argue, is not just unique to Britain. You could actually classify it as a result of a movement which is much wider and stronger than Britain, and it's called national populism. And I would commend this book to you because it, in a way, it's not the panacea, but it does help to marshal one's thoughts into deriving a deep understanding of how right-wing extremist movements have been able to manipulate people and win power legitimately, then ultimately use, in some cases, legitimate means to reinforce their position. And, you know, I mentioned right wing, but you could equally say it happens on the left, or could happen on the left. So in the UK right now, we have a new party. They haven't had a conference yet, but it's called Your Party. And it has apparently over 750,000 members have signed up. They're about to have a conference later in the year in November, so let's wait and see where it goes. We also have, on the other extreme, the Reform Party, which I'm going to come to. But let's get back to national populism, which reflects the Reform Party in some ways. So last Sunday in London, Trafalgar Square, you may have seen some pretty horrendous photographs on television, on the news. And this was well, it ended up in a riot, in my view, and I felt sorry for the police. This was a demonstration under the headline, Unite the Kingdom. Well, what, the kingdom of God or the kingdom of God knows what? I don't know. But anyhow, this demonstration took place, and at the other end of the Whitehall, you had another contrary demonstration to do with Palestine and a few other things. But Elon Musk got involved in this Unite the Kingdom demonstration. And you may remember there was this chap, Farage, who went to Congress about a week ago, and he said, oh, freedom of speech is under attack in the United Kingdom. We're getting like North Korea. Well, bullshit to that. Even Kemi Badenoch said Mr. Farage is a purveyor of excrement.
The leader
But
of conservatives.
wait a minute. What I have to tell you is this. So Elon Musk turns up by video link, not a man who's my favorite, but he manifests this popular nationalism or national populism that I'm trying to describe. So Musk said this, and it's important to quote him verbatim because it's really quite scary. And it could happen here too. I hope to God it doesn't. So Musk told this rally of Unite the Kingdom, I think there's something beautiful about being British. Well, that's noble of him. And what I see happening here is the destruction of Britain. Initially a slow erosion, but rapidly increasing erosion of Britain with massive uncontrolled migration. This is the trigger point. A failure by the government to protect innocent people, including children who are getting gang raped. Well, I don't know how he can prove that, but anyhow. And then Musk told the other supporters of Robinson, who's the leader of this mob, my appeal is to British common sense. Well, we shouldn't have voted for Brexit in that case, but anyhow, which is to look carefully around you and say, if this continues, what would the world be like in the future? This is a message to the reasonable center, the people who ordinarily wouldn't get involved in politics, who just want to live their lives. They don't want that, which he just described. They're quiet. They just go about their business. My message is to them, if this continues, that violence is going to come to you. You will have no choice. Well, what planet are these people on? Because they're just literally trying to foment and whip up fear to cause trouble. And this is what this national populism is all about. So there's 4 characteristics. Now, this isn't my original research. There's far better people than me who've done it in the book that I highlighted. So they suggest 4 Ds, very easy to remember. What causes national populism? Distrust in society, destruction, deprivation, and de-alignment. And they use this very simple analysis to create the framework. And they suggest that this is what's happening, not just in the UK. You could even argue in America how they're being manipulated thanks to social media, etc., that the problems are there too. They could certainly exist in France if one applied these parameters. So let's start with distrust. So there are 2 key points about why we are where we are today. The first is that throughout history, there's always been a tradition in democracy of what you might call elite skepticism toward the masses, and there's a sort of dissociation between the ruling elite and the masses themselves. You could say that's true. There's also a desire to essentially marginalize the influence and the power that citizens have in political decisions. They're feeling more cut off and separated. And there's also, if you like, too, and I would be inclined to agree, there's an apathy amongst the masses to get involved. The abstention rates have gone up. For example, there are 48 million registered voters in the UK, yet at the last general election, the turnout was one of the lowest ever, about 60%. For the Brexit vote, it was over 70%, but even so, not everyone voted out of a population of, say, 68 million. No matter. The second point that builds on this tradition of distrust is that we can now see a growing gap between ordinary citizens and those who are elected to power. You can see that for sure. I mean, most democracies, if you like. So if you look at the US, we're now seeing record numbers of women and ethnic minorities in Congress that should be celebrated, but we've also seen record numbers of millionaires and also degree holders who are involved too, but separated from the masses of the people. How about the second D, destruction? These are all about deep-rooted concerns, I should say, concerning, as I alluded to, migration and ethnic change, causing people to feel insecure. the fear that immigrants are taking jobs. Well, immigrants might be doing jobs which some people don't want to do. And you can see this in the service hotel sector, for example. We can keep going on, but as I promised, I don't wish to be too negative. I just want you to bear in mind the threat of this national populism movement. And you could possibly explain Brexit as being a part of it. You can certainly explain now this new Reform Party who are using what I would venture, well, I definitely say lies, to manipulate and bamboozle people into power. But before we get to that issue, I'd like us to think about this. And I don't know if you know this satirical magazine called Private Eye. Well, the headline, one of the latest headlines is, and this refers to reform, which is really what I think of them, which is why I'm showing it to you. Lunatics take over the asylum. And isn't that rather sad? I hope they don't, because people will wake up, as I'm sure they will ultimately, and realize that these people are just, mendacious. It's probably a polite way of describing it. And so here you have, for example, a photograph, you can look at it later, of Nigel Farage, and the speech bubble coming out of his mouth is, "Oh, there's a general threat to public order." But that's enough about me. So leave it at that. So we have to be wary of being whipped up and manipulated by social media and other ways of stirring dissent. And this makes me think about something else, which I would argue could be applied here too. And it's a whole new academic study program, which is to do with securing or protecting democracy from outside threats using modern technology. So if you look at the Brexit vote, there's no doubt that some of the people who voted were manipulated through social media and bots, etc. And where those bots emanated from, one can debate. Some say FSB, some say other nefarious influences, etc., which is why the margin was, so narrow. I don't wish to go into that subject, but I think you should bear it in mind that democracies are vulnerable. And so for the head of the Reform Party to go to the US Congress and say the UK is becoming like North Korea, in light of what I just read from the mouth of Elon Musk, that isn't true. But they peddle lies, and people who are disgruntled following the 4Ds that I mentioned are therefore susceptible to being manipulated. Well, we need to try and staunch that or control it, because it would clearly boomerang against us. And so this brings us to the point. We voted for Brexit, and what's the balance sheet? Well, if you believe, for example, Lord Heseltine, Michael Heseltine, who was Deputy Prime Minister, he would say, Brexit, pack of lies. And like me, he has actually called for Britain to rejoin the EU, but sadly, as I said at the beginning, that's not really likely in the very near future. But it's the lies, the bamboozling and the hoodwinking, which I think is a travesty. And it's a shame that people have just rolled over and accepted it, and because I suppose people are resigned to the fact that this is the reality, and we may as well get on with it, as indeed is the case. But people like Heseltine, John Major as well, for example, were at the forefront, and even now saying that Brexit was a self-inflicted wound, a huge mistake, and it partially explains why the deficit is as big as it is, and the Chancellor talking about this black hole which needs to be filled and taxes need to go up as a result. Well, had we not had Brexit, we would have had more international trade, and therefore the deficit wouldn't be as large as it is. But that's another debate which we'll come on to later. So the last general election that we had, for example, where the turnout was fairly low, Brexit wasn't mentioned at all. Non-issue, which personally, in light of what I said in my position, I thought was a mistake. But nonetheless, You know the result. The Labour won with a big majority. But although it looked numerically large, it's not as deep as perhaps they would have liked. And therefore, I'd say, in light of the news that we hear today, they may be vulnerable. Especially, you've got reform on the rise, as I've said, and you've got on the other extreme this new party called Your Party, which could be a threat, but it's too early to say. So the Brexit debate has become something completely different. You've now got what's euphemistically called regret. You've got people who regret the damn thing ever happened. And this is all with the benefit of hindsight, but opinion polls that have been done suggest up to about 59% of the respondents say, oh, we wish we'd never voted for this. Well, who in their right mind would vote to become poorer, which sadly is the case. And so the national mood, I would say, is one of regret on leaving the EU. And, you know, the notorious 52-48 margin, in my view, is far too narrow. They should have fixed the bar a lot higher, say 70. Well, maybe that was too high, but say 60-40 or something like that, to make sure that people were really sincere in their voting intentions and really wanted this to happen and were told the truth. They weren't, and that's why we've got the result that we have. So they look on it as a mistake today, and only 2% of the electorate think that it has had a very positive impact on especially the National Health Service, for example. There are, I suppose, a few tangible benefits to try and be objective. Tangible benefits being the free trade deals which have been signed since 2021. And however, they're not as the hype doesn't match the reality, put it that way. Hopefully we'll grow into these new trade deals. But even so, trading with our nearest neighbor, in other words, the European Union, could never compete with these trade deals. It would have surpassed them had we kept it going. Anyhow, so tangible benefits to free trade deals. The rules on VAT have allowed to be taken off sanitary products. Well, that's important in some areas. Private school has now got VAT. That's just probably counterproductive for British soft power. In fact, the Foreign Office, as my colleague here would say, as now we've got a soft power department to look at how Britain can maximize its force for good in the world. And it's not all related to money, it's influence. And soft power is a key. The Irish have always been leaders in this, and the UK, I suppose, are drawing from Irish diaspora experience and how soft power is very important as part of the diplomatic arsenal to win friends and influence people. So we now have a soft power group of advisors to try and maximize our influence because money is tight. And soft power clearly is a good way of keeping UK to the fore in many different areas. So the restricted freedom of movement, that's always a problem now with Brexit, and that's one major drawback. It's really quite serious. So it's led to about a 4% reduction in GDP because of leaving the EU. Had we stayed in, we wouldn't clearly have that problem. Northern Ireland, its status now has finally been clarified under the Windsor Agreement. So if one's looking at doing business between Slovenia and the UK, my advice today would be have a company in the Republic of Ireland. And because of the common travel area and other agreements, you trade with the UK. And you have the advantages of being in Ireland, tax efficient. Goods come from Slovenia via Dublin and then up the road into the UK. There's quite a few people looking into these things. So increased deficit is one problem. We're not likely to rejoin. Some people argue, our friends at the LSE, for example, say that the Brexit vote was driven by the losers of globalization. Well, I don't want to debate the pros and cons of globalization, but it's one angle to look at. as to explaining why people voted for Brexit, because it was an epidemic reaction to a particular time and situation they were living in and was exploited as a result. So how is the UK economy fared? Well, I've tried to touch on this, but you may remember in May of this year, there was a UK-EU summit at Lancaster House, which was part of this reset that I alluded to earlier. And I'd say that the fact that it took place is a success. It's ongoing now to make sure that the topics that were agreed upon are now going to be reinforced. So what are these areas? Well, young people suffered because of Brexit. The Erasmus program, for example, well, that's now being looked at, and hopefully there'll be increased freedom of movement for young people to go and travel in the EU and study, etc. Well, I can say for myself, I went from LSE to study in Paris. It was the best thing I ever did. It's a shame that those experiences are not as easy as they once were. And then you've got the issues to do with visas and ETIAS and passport control, etc., which makes the freedom of movement more difficult. Then you've got work permit issues and so on. And, you know, we had a system that it wasn't perfect, but it did work to facilitate mobility for business and transfer of goods, etc. And it all just got tied up in red tape, which was meant to have been reduced. It's worse now than ever. And I know this from a Chamber of Commerce point of view, because I'm a vice president of London Chamber, and our main source of income now is through certificates of origin. It's all paperwork until the International Chamber decides to digitize it all, which they have, and it'll come on stream eventually. But at the moment, our main source of income, over £1 million, is just doing all that paperwork to facilitate trade. And imagine, you look like an old rocker, imagine if you were in a pop group, British pop groups trying to get access to the EU to play concerts in different cities, etc. It's a nightmare. So even culturally, there's problems. People can't travel the way they used to go and celebrate or party or play music. It's just tied up in bureaucracy. So migration has increased. Well, we're not going to get onto that because it's highly emotive. It's a shame that it has. And again, because of Brexit, we don't have the capability that we used to have to exchange information between police forces on individuals. So the UK is alone in that until we have an agreement whereby that data can be swapped between law enforcement and colleagues on the other side of the English Channel. So that's one reason why we have the immigration issue we have. But if the truth were told, the immigration numbers are actually coming down. They reached their highest in 2023. They're scary right now. I don't disagree with that, but they're not as bad as they were in 2023. And the government's not getting the credit for it. They're certainly trying. There's no doubt about that. So, so let's come down to the balance sheet. And I'll have to read this because I don't have it all in my head. So in food and drink and phytosanitary issues, as you would all know, it's more difficult to import food than it was in the days of the EU. But hopefully that will improve because of the reset that's starting to take place. And I think that was confirmed the other day. Fish, well, that's been sorted out to an extent. Fish exports, particularly with French fishermen in the Channel. Young people have won, as I said. EU fishing vessels get 12 more years of access to UK waters if you're in that kind of business. Do you like fishing? No, but that's an improvement. E-gates, that's a problem everywhere now, and it's going to get worse in the next few weeks when the electronic gate system is introduced throughout the EU, and Foreign Office is warning UK travelers to make sure your passports meet the requirements, because otherwise you'll be denied entry. And hopefully the UK will ultimately conform and it'll be standardized. In defense, Firms may get contracts from the new UK rearmament fund, which obviously would be timely in light of the more insecure environment that we're in with war in Ukraine, etc. In fact, I was just advocating to the British Slovene Chamber this afternoon that they might wish to set up a defense and security subgroup to maybe develop more bilateral business between the UK and Slovenia in that area, because I know there's a center of excellence here. So that could possibly work. What other issues can we add here? Well, as I said, trade has dropped because of the red tape. I've mentioned, if you're interested, pet passports. Now, I knew the lady who lobbied hard for this. Her husband was a former ambassador to Paris, actually. She's Lady Fretwell. And they always had a problem bringing their pets back from France to the UK. And so she lobbied for the pet passport, which was accepted. Well, all that work has now come to naught, sadly. And then you've got all these pampered pooches in Monte Carlo. So you know the owner of EasyJet, Stelios, well, he set up EasyPet. So not that the pets go by plane, but they go by road. For all the rich Brits who want to bring their animals back home, they get pampered on the way up the auto route, and then he clears their documents and they're allowed free access. But pet passports, quite important for some. Cultural and artistic exchange, I mentioned. Professional qualifications. I know most of you are qualified in this room. Well, are they recognized in a reciprocal fashion? They used to be problematic now. So it means, again, it's a restraint on trade and freedom of movement, which is rather sad. So 3/4 of Brits support making it easier for professionals to easily access the EU. It's a no-brainer for me. Cheaper food and more choice. Well, red tape on food and drink I've alluded to. I know Slovenia makes good juice and other related things. Well, we need to have dynamic alignment, as it's called, just to facilitate trade like we used to have. Cut down on wastage and unnecessary delays of paperwork. A lot of perishable goods don't make it to the supermarket because the paperwork takes so long and the goods perish as a result. So we need to reduce trade frictions, for example. Defense industry jobs. Well, we need more cooperation. We used to have it, but not there anymore. Health and security, accident investigations and reporting. That system used to work, doesn't anymore. Lower energy prices, same thing. Intelligence sharing, catching criminals, I alluded to earlier. Well, that's an area I know we're working on in this region, especially under Dame Karen Pierce, who's in the Foreign Office responsible for this kind of liaison. Drug threats, human trafficking, these are all issues that we used to be sharing and working on together. But again, we're disrupted because of Brexit. Border control, I've highlighted. Steel exports. Well, that's a contentious issue all over the EU, because it would be good if we kept an independent steel manufacturing capability rather than letting foreign influences, foreign investors take over. Now, so here we go. Final checklist. So sovereignty, that was what it was all about. So we were told, take back control. Well, sovereignty is a tradable item here. For those who study international relations, you protect your core interests, but anything outside of those concentric circles, like a dartboard, you can trade in exchange for something else that you want. So one of the primary advantages of Brexit is supposedly the restoration of sovereignty. So by leaving the EU, the UK regained full control over its laws, regulations, and policies, free from the jurisdiction of the European Court of Justice. And also, as you know, there's a big debate, let's dump the European Court of Human Rights. Well, I'm dead against that too, but that's a different debate. So in theory, this allows the UK to make independent decisions in areas such as trade, immigration, and domestic legislation without external influence. Well, anyhow, for many Brexit supporters, this reassertion of national sovereignty was, as I said, a crucial factor in why they voted to leave. So immigration control we've highlighted, but no man is an island, and the UK, although it is an island physically, can't retain that position when it comes to thinking about international trade and interdependence. We need to be flexible. Well, and that leads us to trade flexibility. Is trade any easier than it was? I would argue that it isn't. And when you add into the mix, and I commend this book to you as well, the economic consequences of Mr. Trump, you'd expect it to be a vast tome, but this is enough to tell you that we need to be more flexible. Yes, he's here. He's coming to the UK this afternoon or tonight. He's going to sign off on huge deals to do with nuclear, to do with setting up data centers, companies like BlackRock, JP Morgan, all the blue chips are in his plane coming to sign with the UK, which is obviously a good sign. But that's not, is that because of Brexit? Or is it because the UK is cheaper than the neighbors? I don't know. But anyhow, there's good news in the pipeline, and you'll see that on Thursday. Agriculture, well, I think we have a problem there because sadly I know of facts whereby in Lincolnshire, the Garden of England, crops just lie on the ground unpicked and rot. A huge wastage as a result because can't get the pickers to come in like they used to from Lithuania and elsewhere and just work seasonally. And so an awful lot of wastage has happened as a result. Regulatory freedom, I haven't really touched on. So what's the role or the position of the City of London now since Brexit? Is it as influential as it once was? For debate. People's savings, what about investor protection? Are they as well protected now as they were under EU regulations? Another thing to look at. Foreign policy independence. Well, is the UK really independent? Well, no, I don't think so. We do row our own boat, let's say, but we do bear in mind that EU is important strategically for the UK. So how do we make it up? Through other multilateral organizations like NATO, OSCE, etc., and even in trade, WTO, because we need to unite against the United States. I mean, imagine if you're Canada and you hear, oh, your country could become the 51st state of America. Well, we have the Commonwealth. That's united, I would argue, Canada and India in a way that was not thought possible a few months ago, for example. Then you've got other Caribbean Commonwealth countries that have changed their trade routes and supply chains because goods that get transshipped through America, it's more expensive now than it ever used to be. So you have Jamaica and Barbados becoming transshipment hubs for goods that emanate from Africa, etc. So in a way, there's been a beneficial side effect to what Trump has tried to do. Now, national identity. I mentioned the importance of soft power, but UK has an identity which I don't think Brexit enhanced, in my view. But mind you, my family is Scottish and Irish, and we won't get into winding up the English on these issues. But for many, Brexit has reaffirmed a sense, well, I don't necessarily agree with this. Brexit's reaffirmed a sense of national identity and self-determination. Well, the Scots voted to remain, don't forget. So did the Irish. So I find that so-called win a bit contentious, but I'm trying to be balanced. And so the decision to leave the EU was seen as reclaiming control over the country's future, potentially strengthening national unity and purpose among those who supported Brexit. Well, personally, if you see people like this waving the flag and fighting police officers, that's not my identity. And if they really knew the truth, St. George, what was he? If you look at the history, he was Turkish-Palestinian. And if they knew that, I'm sure they wouldn't be talking about him either. But there you go. It's all a bit bizarre. But just in my view means it's a sham, a way of manipulating people to win power. And then there's another agenda which we don't yet know. So that would be my point on that. Labor market impact. Has Brexit helped employment? Sadly, the figures would tell you it hasn't. Particularly youth unemployment has gone up. Has Brexit helped growth? Well, if you look at the latest July GDP figures, neutral, zero growth. So what the hell's been going on? Hopefully, the catalyst will come on Thursday if they sign this agreement. Well, they will actually, for nuclear reactors and data centers and a few other things. That may be a catalyst. But there is economic uncertainty, not self-generated, but it's all to do with what's going on with tariffs, as we all know. Investment decline, well, I don't think there is a decline in investment in light of what I just said, although, to be fair, pharmaceutical companies like Merck, Sharp, and Dohme canceled their investment the other day, as did AstraZeneca. But I think they've more than been made up by what Google have just done and what we're likely to hear later in the week. Now, political division. This is something a bit intangible, but I think nonetheless real. The country has been divided over Brexit, which is perhaps why politicians don't want to talk about it, because it's just picking at a wound. But it needs to be talked about and debated, and the people that I know have gotten over it, want to work around it, want to have a reset, as I said, and let's hope that that works. The administrative burden I alluded to, well, sadly, that's increased. Northern Ireland border issues, well, they'll be dealt with and indeed are. So sadly, the Brexit balance sheet, as of late 2025, the negative economic consequences of Brexit, such as reduced productivity and the widening trade deficit, continue to be more pronounced than any limited gains. And while the government has pointed to some successes, such as the new trade deals, as I elaborated, and the services sector shows resilience, particularly financial services, these positives are outweighed by persistent challenges, including inflation, fiscal vulnerabilities, and a growing financial liability position. Again, this black hole, as it's called. Now, I wanted to come back to this because, as I say, it's not all bad. If you look at what the stock market's been doing, now not everyone invests in the stock market, but one needs to realize that I've just been giving you the macroeconomic interpretation, but there have been people making money, because I've always asked myself, well, who's made money out of Brexit? Because clearly there have been people who have. Hedge funds have made money out of Brexit. If you invested in the stock market since 2016, 2020 and on, you will see it's been quite phenomenal. So the FT index is up 11% this year and 26% over the past 3 years. Well, where do you get that kind of return on your investment? You don't get it in a term deposit in a bank. So up 26% over the past 3 years. The Dow Jones index is 7% ahead this year and 45% since September. So this is clearly what Trump relies on. And so it's quite extraordinary, and that's really the point I want to make, that people are making money and it's not all bad. So if you look at the Journal of Applied Economics, they are advocating that the super rich are making a bigger slice than ever before due to their rising financial wealth and passive capital gains. A major driver of rising inequality is that the wealthy families, their financial portfolios continue to grow, and because of their high share, because of their high yielding assets. Almost a third of the richest 10%'s wealth has been in financial or business assets, making the richest even richer. because of interest on interest, higher property values plus inflation, private pension pots boosted by the Financial Times Stock Exchange Index rising 585% in 3 years, if you can believe that. So there you go. There's money in Brexit for some, but not for me. Not that I was ever thinking like that. I was just shocked that, when I went from LSE, I went to Paris, and it was the best thing I ever did. And it's a shame that that opportunity, well, you can never walk into the same river twice, let's say. But it's a shame that it didn't happen for other people. So let's look at Slovenia. Oh, but I've got to finish with it. So in 2022, when Boris Johnson was Prime Minister, the Foreign Office had to put out, I say had to because I don't think the people who wrote this really believed it. They had to put out a document saying the benefits of Brexit. Now, I've tried to be balanced and give you the pluses and minuses, but this document, well, I don't know how they could have forecast the way they did, but I thought it was very good to mark the territory and talk about the advantages. 57 billion more for the NHS. Well, sorry, that didn't happen. 8 free ports, well, they were talked about but haven't really materialized. And no longer paying EU budget contributions. I think in some cases we would perhaps like to, if it was to help with intelligence sharing with the police, etc. So yeah. I'll let you have a look at this and you make up your own minds on how accurate this was. But I mean, given that it was under the Prime Minister of Boris Johnson, you have to debate the truthfulness of anything. Now, when it comes to UK Slovenia, to end on, I'd just like to highlight this. And we have a representative from the British Embassy here this evening, and I know he will agree with me. There's a very good relationship between UK and Slovenia, and Ambassador Šetinc and I go back a long way, and I know he was instrumental in making sure that the foundations were laid for a strong relationship. And so in my role, being involved with Chambers of Commerce, I can tell you that UK-Slovenian trade has certainly vastly improved. It's over €1 billion right now, which in the scheme of things is amazing in a very short time. And I would put that down to the work of the embassy and the British Slovene Chamber, embassy, and both in London and here, because it has been a very close team effort on both sides. So I'll just read you, and correct me if I'm wrong, but the last joint statement on Slovenia was in July 2024. I don't think there's been anything more recent than that, to my knowledge. So this is the summary of UK-Slovene relations as of now, July 18th, 2024. So they're building on the joint statement of intent in 2022, and they want to focus on, the two governments focus on collaboration in foreign policy, security, and economic affairs. So the leaders agreed at the time the importance of fighting terrorism and organized crime, including irregular migration. They've agreed to enhance law enforcement cooperation by sharing strategic analysis and expertise, improving real-time information sharing between law enforcement agencies and prosecutors, working together to close loopholes exploited by organized crime, and strengthening justice cooperation. Well, I know further down in Serbia, there's a similar agenda, which under Dame Karen, she's been helping, and with the Berlin agreement, or whatever you call it, protocol, what's it called? Yeah, the process, that's all to include these initiatives here. So the Slovene Minister of Foreign Affairs, Tanja Fajon, met with her counterpart, David Lammy, who's now Deputy Prime Minister, the new Foreign Secretary, Yvette Cooper. And they both affirmed excellent cooperation between two NATO allies, noting their collaboration on the UN Security Council, particularly as it relates to Palestine. And as you would know, the UK will soon be recognizing Palestine along with France, much to the chagrin of Netanyahu. So this joint statement on the humanitarian situation in Gaza, this dates from the 12th of August, 2025, and the UK signed it along with Slovenia, and it's principally a call to action. The signatories made urgent calls for immediate and permanent ceasefire in Gaza and the release of all hostages and a massive increase in humanitarian aid. Well, in light of what the UN announced from Geneva today about genocide, etc., how it couldn't happen quick enough, but who am I to say? Now, I think that's, are you satisfied? Because I could go on, but have you had enough time for questions, I suppose? But before I finish, I would like you to commend this book. This is something to do with futurology. If Russia wins, it's written in the year 2028. And I hope it never happens, but I think forewarned is forearmed. So I would commend that to you. And then if you really want something that'll put you to sleep, but it's not that bad. This is about Between the Waves, the origins of how the UK came to join the EU, going back to the Schuman, Monnet, Second World War, and the rationale of how we've always had a kind of love-hate, plus and minus relationship. You know, we can't change our address. It's geographical determinism. We're in Europe, whether you like it or not. So I think we have to get on, and that would be my quest, which is really why I'm here. So on that note, thank you, Marjan, and I hope you enjoyed what I have to say.
Thank you, Richard. Thank you for your analysis and accounts. I would say too much to grasp.
It's a big subject.
Our meeting, but never. There were many points you tackled. Maybe for the start, before our audience warms up, how is it possible that Farage and his cronies base the program on one single issue: the immigrants out?
Well, that's what they press the, oh, sorry. No, that's not unusual. They make scapegoats. They press the emotional buttons. They know that's what sells. There's only 4 of them in Parliament who represent reform. There are more at the local level, but I think gradually they'll be found wanting and will be voted out too. So we're not needing to have an election for another 4 years. So hopefully within that time they'll be found wanting and will disappear. And hopefully that's a sufficient time for the current government or whoever's in charge at the time to neutralize them.
That's wishful thinking, because we see that.
Well, I haven't got a crystal ball. It's concerning, which is why I started with national populism, because I don't think this trend is unique to the UK. So we need to challenge it as democracies. However, well, I know you have a particular opinion on how democracies work or don't work, but I do think, however, that we need to defend democracy because it's potentially under attack. If you look at what's going on in America, I never forget a book that I read. It's more prescient now than it was when I first read it. It's called The Perverted Priorities of American Politics, written by a professor called Dwayne Lockhart. It was written in the early 70s, and it was about the power of money to pervert the course of democracy, let's say. You buy influence and get elected, and that enables you to prosecute your agenda. Well, I think we're witnessing the same thing now. And so it's the old trick. You create a scapegoat. In this case, it's immigrants. Whether it's true or not, it doesn't matter, but they press the right buttons, wrap themselves in the flag, save the kingdom. Well, what I didn't mention was according to a recent book, the late Queen was a Remainer. Well, I suppose that's goes without saying, but she was most definitely. And of course, any conversation with the Queen was meant to be confidential, but somebody leaked it. And the palace didn't deny it, so you can assume that it was true. Because had she denied it, that would have been positive for those who wanted Brexit. So they had to take a position above the foray and not say anything one way or the other. So I think it's fair to say that the Queen was a Remainer, and I miss her, but that's a different issue. So yes, they manipulate people, and that's what's happening. And with social media particularly, just go and look at TikTok. I go back to when the IRA, for example, and you all know what they were like. Just to keep young people interested, they'd go on TikTok and be influencers. It happens.
Well, the floor is open. Just say your name for the sake of recording.
Marko Watch,
And
former banker, not really a diplomat, but I was fascinated with your tour d'horizon. It's not fair in 45, 60 minutes to elaborate on.
it should be green.
Green.
It
Is
is.
it green? I don't see it. Okay.
And close.
To cut my comment and question short. Very powerful. Obviously, you were fair enough, honest enough to say I'm a Remainer, and I try to be very objective. At the same time, you started saying we will not see re-entry in my lifetime, which was also said by your prime minister not too long ago, and he's probably younger than you are. So basically, a very pessimistic interpretation.
Closer.
Then you go on for an hour saying that basically the evidence is more in favor of we have lost more than we have gained with the exit. So what more will it take for the British public to change their minds, not in a generation or two, but earlier? I mean, you've always been a relatively pragmatic nation. You coped with all kinds of adverse things in a very, say, down-to-earth way. And here, this is a myth nobody wants to touch upon. No politician in UK talks about when do we start a real talk about shouldn't we join back to Europe?
Sure.
Go closer.
Well, I'll tell you what I think could happen. The current government have, they would like to enable younger people to vote. So if they reduce the age of voting, that will attract more young people who are more than likely to be more susceptible to a European idea. So that's one plus on your side of the box. Also, those who did vote Brexit, some of them perhaps, as I've said, regret it. Equally, others will have died off. So if you renew the franchise by widening the demography, it will facilitate a more positive result. That's maybe wishful thinking. We have to wait and see. But that is definitely likely. The other alternative, well, you hear all these negative stories, oh, there's a brain drain and non-doms are leaving. Well, let them go, I would say, because some of them are condoms, in my opinion, and that's a different issue. Just because of tax, well, I pay my taxes, I'm happy to do so. But others, well, they're just landing, use the UK as an aircraft carrier and derive the benefits without maybe paying for them. Anyhow, that's a different debate. And then you've got others who, well, they're disaffected, they go and pay money and buy a passport in the Caribbean or take up residency in Monaco and so on.
You're getting all the Americans to the UK.
Well, I saw this more and more, but that's because of what's going on there. Portugal probably getting more than the UK at the moment. But there is this migration, but they're the less than 1% multimillionaires of the world who've got disposable income. Some are going the other way from Europe, as far away from Europe to Argentina, because they're afraid we might have a war and they want to get out of a potential war zone. I know people like that. Personally, that's not my attitude. I hope instead of well, we were saying this last night. What I would hope is that we put more emphasis on alternative dispute resolution than going on this slippery slope to war. But that's easier said than done.
Even
My name works.
works, but
I'll shout.
very close.
This movement,
Yes.
I have to say that we are privileged to be here. Hope that you will visit us again. I have a question concerning the strength of the European Union. When you look at us from your perspective, from your history, your opinion about the European Union might be regarded as very valuable. And I have three questions. What do you think about the powers that could tear the European Union apart? For example, the romanticism of the grandeur of some European nations. How much could it be negative concerning the perspective of the European Union on one side, or on the other side, the strong codification of the European Union? There are so many laws, so many rules, people might get fed up with it. Small, big enterprises don't like it that much. And maybe the third reason that could be not very positive for the European Union as such, the role of the Charlemagne, it's a revival of the Bonapartism or the national state of Labour too. Or are there some other factors that could be not very useful for the economy of us?
Well, I kind of alluded to a possible solution in this relatively new area of academic study, which is to do with democracy protection, democracy security. We thrive as democracies on being open and tolerant. So that's why I started with Musk, because what he says is the antithesis of everything I know to exist and wish to preserve. And so we need to protect ourselves. So my first way of answering your question would be just that. We need to encourage people to not just take for granted what we have, but how we should protect it from outside nefarious influences. And in some cases, they're homegrown because they're part of an international network that feeds off each other. And I can only give you an example of what I know in the UK. Why do you think the head, the leader of reform is in Trump's pocket? There's a plan. I'm quite sure of it. He fell out with Elon Musk, but he nonetheless was able to come through to this demonstration over the weekend virtually and pontificate the way I read out, which is just horrendous. We need to stop that. The homegrown issues, I agree. If you look at France, because of the increased instability there, they are perhaps riper than anywhere for trouble, which needs to be staunched or assuaged. I don't know which, maybe a bit of both, I think. Same in Italy. So we have problems, but I did read something interesting which suggested that the new democracies, like Slovenia, let's say, could lead by example and teach the old dogs new tricks, let's say, by working out more flexible ways of doing things, because if you look at what Yugoslavia was, a multiracial, multi-ethnic, multi-religious society, which did work after all, admittedly, in some cases, draconian force was needed, let's say. There could be lessons to be learned there, which the old ones don't know about. So my idea for you might be to set up a center in Slovenia for the study of democracy, a new one to make new suggestions on how one can cherish and protect and develop, because as Churchill said, democracy is not perfect, but is better than a lot of the other alternatives along the lines of what Farage is suggesting. Because all he's doing is finding a way to manipulate people so that he and his acolytes can come to power for their own purposes, not for the good of any country.
Ironically enough, such a center was established in Belfast.
Uh-huh.
I'm not sure whether it still does the job.
Well, I'll have a look. Very interesting.
Ambassador Grabowczyk, don't touch the mic. Just
You hear
speak.
me?
Of course we can hear you.
Thank you, Richard. By the way, my wife told me, well, she said that I'm going to have to report on what you said.
Did I give you enough paper?
No, I took notes.
Yeah.
Nevertheless, Trump is coming to Windsor, right?
Yes.
And you're from Windsor.
Yes.
Right? That he will not spend his 2 nights.
He won't spend them with me.
In your house.
No, he's a more salubrious place.
And today I read an article about the king and Trump being very different persons, very characters, very different. And the task, one of the tasks of the king is going to be somehow to convince it how the war in Ukraine is important. In fact, the involvement of the West in the Ukraine, and to convince Trump. This leads me to the question: domestic and foreign policy has been always connected, but has been more connected in the last years because of the Ukraine, the war in Ukraine and Gaza. Do you think that the war in Ukraine somehow made feel some Britons that a common action with the EU is needed, necessary?
Well, how do you define common? Does that mean direct military? No, I don't think people want to really do that.
Traditionally, in Europe, we think one of our prejudices is positive, say, that the Brits can be quite belligerent. They can march. They like to march against the Germans, against the Malvinas, against the Falklands.
Yeah, but that was history. We're dealing with different type of warfare now.
Is it very different?
I would say yes. In fact, it's interesting you bring this up, because I was looking at the fact that there is war in Ukraine. We need to even rewrite the laws of war to include cyborgs and drones and robots, etc., because Ukraine is effectively increasingly a testing ground for new weaponry. In a way, you could argue, and this is a terrible thing to say, but there probably is an element of truth in it, that the war in Ukraine is being perpetuated to allow these experiments to take place, which is frankly awful. There's too much. It's like it's ineluctable, which is why I just mentioned, why can't we get diplomats to think of alternative dispute resolution in some way of, I hate this term, but it's the only one I can find an off-ramp to stop this. And Trump, oh, I've made peace in 7 countries. Well, I don't tend to believe that. And I'm going to get peace on day 1 in Ukraine. Well, that hasn't happened. And the way he belittled Zelensky in the Oval Office, I thought was just horrible too. And who wants to make peace with a man like that? And Putin is obviously playing him. I don't know personally, obviously, but that would be my reading of it. So there's too many other agendas. So we need new ideas and new people to bring them about. And Trump just sees it as a kind of property investment, if you ask me. I think the first time he heard of the Gaza Strip, and forgive this stupid joke, he thought it was a nightclub. So, it's a problem.
Ambassador Kunic.
You're getting religious. I thought you're giving him a blessing.
Thank you. Let me put this way.
Yes, sir.
You lost European Union, but you have Commonwealth.
Oh,
Can you explain a little bit this fact? How is your country doing business with Commonwealth? In the light of losing a lot?
Well, you see, I like that question because I obviously, as you heard, I had no control over it. I was born in Bermuda, and that's still a British colony. My father was a government civil servant, so hence Bermuda. And then Bahamas, he was dealing with defense, police, and all these related things. So Bahamas got independent in 1973, and my family stayed on, but always with a British angle. Now, the Commonwealth, I believe in, I support. However, when UK joined the Commonwealth, our loyalties were divided, let's say, and we were focusing more on making the EU work. And the Commonwealth, because of its vast spread, both economically, ethnically, and geographically, wasn't always workable. The Canada, Australia, New Zealand, those and South Africa to a certain extent were workable, but all the others, particularly the small microstates in the Caribbean, were less attractive. So they were enabled to go off and do their own things at offshore financial centers, etc. And some made a going of it, others less successful. So the remaining Caribbean places like Turks and Caicos, British Virgin Islands, Anguilla, etc., are all in a similar niche, financial services. In Anguilla now, they have quite a unique internet address, which is quite attractive for people. However, the answer to your question is, I think that sadly, now with Brexit, that Britain is trying to rediscover the Commonwealth, but the Commonwealth has moved on and it's more difficult to do. And it's a sad thing to see when you look at when the UK was in the EU, British aid was commingled with European money, and it amounted to quite a lot. Whereas now, if you go in the Caribbean, and I've seen it with my own eyes, you have EU aid and then British aid, and the British aid is often smaller than what's on offer from the EU, and it is a bit embarrassing. But we do provide naval protection, hurricane relief protection when the Navy's around during hurricane season, and I can vouch for that. It's been most welcome and saved a lot of lives in the Bahamas especially. But there is a problem there that the Commonwealth have moved to a different agenda now, particularly in the Caribbean, on this reparations jag for slavery. They want compensation and so on, and that's clearly a very thorny issue, which beyond my pay grade, let's say. But I support the Commonwealth. It's important to the king. It was certainly important to his mother, and we would like to make more of it, in my opinion. I certainly work with them on trade issues, particularly well, here's the point. The antidote to Trump tariffs is called intra-Commonwealth trade. That's the soundbite, and it's true. It's cheaper to trade intra-Commonwealth than, as I was describing, going via the east coast of America, then transshipped to Commonwealth countries. Now they're changing the supply chains, thinking far more strategically in ways of intra-Commonwealth linkages in ways that have never existed before. And it's working. I was speaking at a conference last Friday, which was to do with Uganda, Ghana. We didn't have Nigeria because they would have predominated as they tend to do. But Uganda was quite interesting for the goods that they wish to export to the Caribbean. And now even coming to London, the direct flights from Entebbe, which there didn't used to be, etc. So these intra-Commonwealth links are now being rediscovered, and some of them brand new.
Free trade agreement between the UK and India.
Exactly. Well, that's a more interesting one because I've been looking at the Pakistan one, which we need to further enhance. So all these Commonwealth connections are unique to the UK, and you know, because of being in the EU, we didn't allow them to develop the way they could have, and now we're starting to encourage them.
Maybe one last question. Chris. Just
made a very interesting point, I thought, when you were talking about citizens as opposed to, you know, the governments, but what are in a democratic society, governments should be reflecting their citizens.
Sure, but they're not.
But the question is, why not? And why is there so much apathy? Because Brexit was definitely lost through, you know, apathy. Probably because people thought it was a no-brainer. Of course we were going to stay in the Europe.
Well, as a failed political person, I'll tell you my experience. You have to let sleeping dogs lie in some cases. So if people are apathetic, let them stay apathetic. What you have to do is to get out your vote that you've already identified. So you know the people who are going to vote for you, you want to make sure that they express their franchise. You don't want to wake up the whole neighborhood because you might lose, because that's what I used to do, being an idealist. I'd knock on every door, talk to everybody, and of course they say they vote for you, but they obviously didn't. And then I learned the hard way. So you have to do voter identification, get your vote out. So apathy, well, if they're apathetic, fine. Just make sure you get the motivated ones and make sure they vote for you. And that's what happens. So if you win by one, you win by one. You still won. And that's the problem. And you see young people now, they get their news and information in a very different way from all this guff. You know, it's online and they're far more sophisticated and therefore, in my view, easily manipulated. Not that we're not by reading traditional methods.
Particularly, let's call them the bad guys.
Yeah.
I mean, you know, that just means they're different to maybe what you and I would.
Sure.
It may not be actually bad guys. But the reality is, the things that we are losing on is that we are not using enough of modern technology, the internet, to wake up the apathetic.
That's what I've been pleading about, having courses on democratic protection and security. There's only one university in the UK, to my knowledge, which does this, and it's called the University of Buckingham, which is under attack. In my view, it's under attack. A Russian group made a bid for it to buy it the other day for a derisory £30 million, and they said no. But I thought that they have these courses. And I also studied at the University of Portsmouth, their Institute for Criminal Justice, which is a contradiction in terms. But anyhow, they're starting to look into how social media manipulates people for good and for ill. And this is all part of what I'm saying, democratic protection. We need to cherish what we've got and encourage people to think likewise.
I think that with this note, we should finish our
all right.
Talk.
I'll invite me back and to be continued.
Thank you, our speaker.
Yeah, thank you.
It was, as I said earlier, too much to grasp in one little hour. Everybody, I invite for a little applause, and that will be ending our session.
Thank you. Well, thank you.